They gave him
We must
30
act now. The
seconds to
consequences of
speak
delay are
before
too
they
grave.
laughed.
I
30
implore you to
seconds.
consider the evidence
That's how
before
long
us.
it took four
We must proceed
admirals,
with caution
men
and
with more
unity.
brass on their
Our
chests than a
decisions here
hardware
will
store,
define our
to
future.
decide that Lieutenant Commander Yusuf
Gentlemen, the
Adebayo
situation has
was worth
escalated. The
less
breach
than the
occurred at
chair he
0200
was sitting
hours.
in.
We must
I was
mobilize
there.
immediately. Every
I had a
second
notebook.
counts.
I had a pen that kept running dry at the worst moments, which felt, in retrospect, like the universe's editorial comment on the whole proceeding. I was not supposed to care what happened in that room. I cared anyway. Here is what nobody tells you about military courts. The silence before a verdict sounds like a held breath that the entire building is taking. The fluorescent lights buzz at a frequency that feels designed specifically to loosen a person's dignity from their bones. The chairs are hard in a way that seems intentional, as if comfort might give the accused too much confidence. Yusuf sat in that chair like he'd been born in it. I wrote that down. Then I crossed it out. Then I wrote it again. Because the thing about a man who has already been broken and rebuilt himself with his own two hands is that he doesn't sit the way frightened men sit. He doesn't grip the table. He doesn't clear his throat 6 times. He doesn't look at the door like it owes him an escape. He just waits. And the waiting was the thing that made Admiral Hargreaves laugh first. A short sound, dismissive, like he'd seen this particular flavor of arrogance before and found it almost quaint. I was going to write an objective report. I was going to keep my professional distance. That laugh ended that plan entirely. What followed was one of the most precise, devastating, and quietly historic moments I have ever witnessed in 22 years of covering military proceedings across 4 continents. Not because anyone threw a punch. Not because anyone wept. Not because there was a dramatic revelation or a document slapped on a table. Because a man who had every reason to beg, instead, explained, and the room never recovered. My name is irrelevant to this story. I say that not out of false modesty, but because the moment I walked into Courtroom B of the Naval Administrative Complex in Norfolk, Virginia, on a Tuesday in late November that smelled like old carpet and institutional disappointment, I became effectively a recording device in a blazer. Senior correspondent. 22 years. I have covered courts-martial in 3 countries. I have watched men confess to things that would unbraid your spine. I have sat in rooms where careers died like lights going out, one by one, with no ceremony. I have never once written the words, "I did not expect that," in a professional document. I wrote them 3 times that Tuesday. My pen kept dying. I go through pens the way some people go through anxious habits, compulsively, without learning. I had 4 in my breast pocket. By the time Lieutenant Commander Yusuf Adebayo was escorted through the side door at 0830, I was already on the second one. He didn't look at the gallery. Most defendants do. It's involuntary. The human need to locate familiar faces to triangulate safety. Yusuf walked in and looked at the panel table directly, the way you look at a thing you've been thinking about for a long time and have made a separate peace with. 4 admirals. 1 rear admiral. 2 captains serving as adjunct assessors. A JAG prosecutor named Lieutenant Commander Patricia Sowell, who had the quietly terrifying competence of someone who had never in her life been caught unprepared. And a defense counsel, a young lieutenant named Marcus Webb, who looked like he had slept in his uniform, which he had, because I'd seen him in the parking lot at 0600 still reading from a legal pad. The charge: conduct unbecoming, failure to follow orders. And the one that carried the real weight, the one that had gotten this case elevated to flag-level attention, willful insubordination in a combat-adjacent theater, resulting in material deviation from authorized operational parameters. Which is a very long way of saying Yusuf had done something they hadn't told him to do. And it had worked. I should explain the case, because the case is not simple, and the people who had already decided it was simple were the people sitting at the panel table. 8 months prior, during a joint NATO exercise off the coast of Portugal that had quietly shifted from exercise to active advisory support for a partner nation's anti-trafficking interdiction, the kind of thing that doesn't make press releases, Lieutenant Commander Adebayo had been the senior naval officer aboard the USS Pharaoh, a guided missile destroyer performing what was officially characterized as passive observation and communication relay. Passive observation. He had watched, for 6 hours, A vessel carrying what his own intelligence assessment identified as 43 civilians, intercepted from a trafficking network operating across two governments' blind spots, began to take on water. He had logged the distress. He had relayed the distress. He had received, in return, a series of communications that amounted, with diplomatic precision, to "not our theater, not our problem, maintain current posture." He had maintained current posture for 4 minutes. Then, he had deviated from authorized operational parameters. He had pulled 41 people out of the water. 2 of them had already gone under by the time his team reached the vessel. He knew their names. I know because I'd done the research. He'd requested their names from the Moroccan Coast Guard 3 weeks after the operation, during the period when he was already under investigation, when requesting anything at all was probably not strategically wise, and he had written them in the margin of his personal log. Ibrahim, age 9. Nadia, age 6. He had written them, and then, below them, written nothing else. Just the names, sitting there like stones dropped in water. I know this because his defense counsel, Marcus Webb, had handed me that log page with the flat effect of a man who had run out of ways to be appalled. "I'm not supposed to show you this," Webb had said. "I'm showing you this." The proceedings opened at 0845. Admiral Chester Hargreaves, the presiding officer, the man whose name would appear at the top of whatever verdict came out of this room, was 63 years old, and he had the face of a man who had spent 4 decades being correct and found the experience mildly exhausting. He was not cruel. I want to be precise about that. He was not a villain in the way stories sometimes need villains to make their meaning clean. He was a man who believed, with the steady certainty of deep faith, in the architecture of order, that the structure of command was not a bureaucratic inconvenience, but a load-bearing wall, and that individuals who kicked out load-bearing walls, even with the best of intentions, brought ceilings down on everyone. He was not wrong to believe that. He was wrong about Yusuf, Lieutenant Commander Adebayo. Hargreaves's voice was the color of old wood. "You have been afforded the opportunity to make an unsworn statement before this panel proceeds to deliberation. You are under no obligation to speak. If you choose to speak, you may not be cross-examined on the substance of your statement. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." "Do you wish to make a statement?" "Yes, sir." The gallery, about 30 people, a mix of JAG staff, Yusuf's fellow officers who'd come in their dress uniforms, 2 civilian observers from the DoD, and me, with the particular quality of quiet that happens when a room collectively decides to pay attention. Admiral Hargreaves leaned back exactly 1 centimeter. "You have 30 seconds to collect your thoughts." Rear Admiral Thomas Beaumont, seated to Hargreaves's left, said something to the captain beside him. "Lo, I caught 1 word, performance." He said it the way you say a word you've used before about this type of person in this type of situation, a word you keep in a drawer for it. Then Beaumont smiled. It was a small smile, the smile of a man who has already written the end of a story and is simply waiting for the characters to catch up to him. Yusuf heard it. I don't know how. The room was not silent enough to carry a single word from that distance. But something in Yusuf's posture, almost nothing, the smallest recalibration like a ship adjusting ballast, told me he had heard something or sensed something and had filed it and would not forget it. He looked at his hands for 3 seconds. Then he looked up. "I'm going to tell you about the water," he said. "Now I'd like to explain my actions. Not with all due respect to this panel. Not any of the careful, legalistic, self-protective language that Marcus Webb had almost certainly spent 72 hours coaching into him. I'm going to tell you about the water." Admiral Hargreaves's expression did not change. It didn't need to. The slight tightening at the corners of his eyes was change enough. The water at that position, Yusuf said, was 61 degrees Fahrenheit. I know that because I checked it at 0340 when we first made visual on the vessel in distress. I checked it because I have a background in maritime rescue protocols. I checked it because I know what 61-degree water does to a human body. He paused. Not for drama. For breath. Adults, he said, lose useful muscle function in 61-degree water in approximately 30 minutes. Children lose it faster. Infants lose it so fast the number is not a comfort to say out loud. The fluorescent lights buzzed. I received the first denial at 0347. I received the second at 0412. I received the third at 0431. He was not reading from anything. Every number came out of him like it lived there. At 0435, I made my decision. At 0437, my team was in the water. At 0503, we had recovered 41 survivors. He stopped. 2 of them. He said, "We did not recover in time." The room breathed. I would like this panel to understand something that I have thought about every day for 8 months. He looked at Admiral Hargreaves directly, the way he'd looked at that panel table when he walked in. I do not regret my decision. I want to be honest about that, because I believe you deserve honesty more than you deserve the performance of remorse I don't feel. Admiral Beaumont's smile was gone. What I regret, Yusuf said, is that I was in a position to make that decision at all. I regret that the system that I have served for 19 years put a man in a destroyer 300 meters from drowning children and told him to observe. I regret that I received 3 denials in 48 minutes, and that none of those denials came with a reason. Not a tactical reason, not a diplomatic reason, not even a bureaucratic reason. They just came, like weather, like something that didn't require justification because the people issuing them could not imagine that justification would be demanded of them. He turned, then, and this is the moment I broke my second pin, and looked at Admiral Beaumont. "I am not performing humility for this panel," Yusuf said. "I'm not going to. I know what that would cost me to do, and I know what it would give you, and I do not believe the trade is fair. What I will tell you is this." The room had stopped breathing entirely. "My career is yours to do with as you see fit. My record is yours to read. My decision on that morning in that water temperature with those specific people going under, that decision is mine. It belongs to me. And when I am 80 years old and I am accounting for my life, the 41 people I pulled out of the water will be on that ledger. The 2 I did not reach in time will be on it too. In this court proceeding," he paused, "will not." The silence after that lasted 7 seconds. I counted. I count things when I don't know what else to do with my hands. 7 seconds of a courtroom full of naval officers and legal staff and 2 civilian observers saying nothing, and in that silence, something happened to the architecture of the room. I can't explain it more precisely than that. The ceiling didn't come down. The lights didn't change. Admiral Hargreaves didn't move. But the weight in the room shifted. Like ballast, Admiral Beaumont had his hands flat on the table. His face had the particular blankness of a man who has had something taken from him and hasn't yet decided whether to be angry about it or simply to adjust. Marcus Webb, Yusuf's defense counsel, was staring at his legal pad. He had written nothing on it. There was nothing to write. His client had just refused, in the most precise and unshowy way I had ever witnessed, to be smaller than the thing he'd done. Lieutenant Commander Sowell, the JAG prosecutor, had a pen to her notepad and had paused mid-stroke. I recognized the pause. It's the pause of a professional who has encountered something they need to reclassify. Admiral Hargreaves looked at Yusuf for a long moment. "Is that the entirety of your statement?" he said. "Yes, sir. You're done." I said what I needed to say, sir. Hargreaves nodded. Once, slowly, the way you nod when someone has handed you an object you weren't expecting and you're still figuring out its weight. "This panel will recess for deliberation," he said. "We will reconvene at 1400. I went to the hallway. I stood by a window that looked out on a parking lot and a gray November sky, and I clicked my third pen open and closed 17 times before I wrote anything. What I wrote was this. He didn't ask them to understand him. He asked them to be worth understanding. Then I crossed that out too because it was too neat, and the thing I just watched was not neat. It had edges. It had the Ibrahim Nuttiest-shaped hole in it that Yusuf hadn't mentioned by name in that room, but which sat in everything he'd said like water sits in the shape of whatever holds it. Marcus Webb came out of the courtroom door, still holding his legal pad with a blank page. He stood next to me. He looked at the parking lot. He didn't tell me he was going to say any of that. Webb said. "No," I said. "He spent 3 days going over the mitigation strategy with me. He knows what voluntary remorse does to sentencing outcomes. He knows exactly what cooperative framing costs in terms of he knows, I said. Webb looked at his blank legal pad. He just decided not to. Yes. A long pause. The two kids, Webb said. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. At 13:47, 13 minutes before the panel was due to reconvene, I was told by a JAG clerk that the deliberation had concluded. Early, which meant either it had been very easy or it had been very hard, and those two things in a military court produced the same result in different ways. I went back to my seat. Yusuf was already in his chair. His posture was the same. The waiting was the same. I found myself looking at his hands, still open on the table, the way hands look when they have decided to stop bracing for impact. The panel filed back in. Admiral Hargreaves sat. He had a single sheet of paper in front of him. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked up, and for the first time since the proceedings began, he looked at Yusuf not as a subject, but as something else, something that required a recalibration I could see him actively resisting and actively unable to complete. Lieutenant Commander Adebayo, he said. Sir, what happened next is part 2. What I will tell you is this. I went through all 4 pens by the end of it, and I still don't think I wrote it right. Admiral Hargreaves read the verdict aloud at 14:02. He read it the way men read things they have not entirely made peace with. Not slowly, because slowness implies deliberation, and he was past deliberation, but with a kind of measured cadence that put careful distance between the words, as if the spacing itself was doing some structural work he didn't trust the words to do alone. Guilty. Conduct unbecoming. Guilty. Failure to follow orders. He paused. The courtroom was the kind of still that has texture. I could hear the ventilation system in the ceiling. I could hear someone in the gallery shift their weight and then immediately regret having done so. Willful insubordination in a combat-adjacent theater, resulting in material deviation from authorized operational parameters. Another pause. Longer. Not guilty. Marcus Webb's pen hit the floor. He didn't pick it up. He just stared at the space in front of him, and his mouth opened slightly, and he performed the very specific expression of a man who had prepared for every outcome except the correct one. Yusuf didn't react. Not a flinch, not a release of breath, not the shoulder drop that usually lives in people when the worst thing recedes. He just sat and listened and waited as if the verdict was information he was filing away rather than a sentence his life had been hinging on for 8 months. That stillness cost something. I didn't know the price yet. I'd find out. The sentencing portion of a court-martial runs immediately after findings in most cases. Admiral Hargreaves, looking at the paper in front of him with the expression of a man who has just rearranged a room and isn't sure yet if he's improved it, outlined the consequence. Official reprimand. Entered in a permanent record. Reduction in promotion eligibility for a period not less than 2 years. No confinement. No superación. No stripping of rank. Admiral Beaumont, to Hargreaves's left, had said nothing since the deliberation ended. He was very still. His hands were still flat on the table. He looked like a man who had arrived at a conclusion about something and was choosing carefully and with great effort not to say it out loud. I was watching in the way I always watch the people who aren't speaking in rooms where something important just happened. The speaker is the event. The people not speaking are the story. Beaumont had 3 stars. He had 40 years. He had, from the way he'd carried himself throughout the morning, a very specific idea of what this courtroom was for and what it was supposed to produce. He had watched Yusuf sit in that chair and refused to perform penitence for 41 people who were alive because of him, and he had sat through a verdict that declined on the most serious charge to punish that refusal, and I could see it, the way you can see pressure building in a thing that has no outlet, not finished. He leaned forward. Permission to address the defendant, he said to Hargreaves. Protocol allows this. It happens rarely. It is generally inadvisable. Hargreaves looked at Beaumont for a moment, and whatever passed between 2 men who had spent 4 decades in the same institution and understood each other's registers with the fluency of a shared language. It was brief, and it was not a refusal. Granted, Hargreaves said. Beaumont looked at Yusuf. You stood up in this court this morning, Beaumont said, and you told this panel that you do not regret your decision. His voice was even, controlled. The control was the thing to watch. It was the kind of control that requires constant maintenance. You told us that this proceeding would not appear on your personal ledger. You suggested, implicitly, that the orders you defied were not worth your compliance. Yusuf said nothing. He was looking at Beaumont with the same quality of attention he'd given the room all morning, complete, unflinching, and somehow non-aggressive, which was the most aggressive thing about it. I want you to understand something, Beaumont said. I have served this institution for 41 years. I have lost men under my command because of decisions I made in theaters where the cost of deviation from operational parameters was not abstract. It was not two children who were already gone before anyone could reach them. He stopped. Something moved through his face. It was brief. It was men I put in positions that cost them everything because I believed in the structure of command. Because I believe that the individual who decides he knows better than the chain creates a liability that outlasts any single good decision he makes. The ventilation system hummed. You may be right, Beaumont said, about what you did on that morning. I'm not equipped to tell you you're wrong about 41 people being alive. He paused. I'm telling you that the man who made that decision, the man who decided the chain was wrong and acted on that decision, is a more dangerous officer than a less capable one. Because capability makes defiance look righteous. And righteous defiance is the thing that has ended more careers, more missions, and more lives than I'm going to stand here and enumerate. He sat back. That's what this reprimand is, Beaumont said. It's not punishment for saving people. It's a record that you are capable of deciding when the chain is wrong. And I need the next 20 officers who read your file to know that about you. He was done. The room sat with it. I had expected Yusuf to absorb that in silence. He had been absorbing things in silence all morning, and he had done it with the efficiency of a man who has had a great deal of practice. He didn't. Admiral Beaumont. Beaumont looked at him. It wasn't a look that invited continuation. Yusuf continued. The men you lost, he said. Not a question, just a phrase, placed down carefully. Beaumont's expression didn't change. The muscles around his jaw did. Barely. You know their names, Yusuf said. It wasn't a challenge. I want to be precise about that. It had no aggression in it, no rhetorical strategy. It was a statement that arrived in the room like a stone arriving in still water. Small impact, rings moving outward. He wasn't asking Beaumont to confess something. He was recognizing something. You wrote them somewhere, Yusuf said, or you said them somewhere, to someone, or to no one. Because that's what you do with names you carry. You find a place to put them. The silence in the room changed quality. It became something you could almost see. I have two names, Yusuf said. Ibrahim, Nadia. I carry them the same way you carry yours. That's not a defense. That's not an argument. That's just, I want you to know that I understand what you're describing. The cost, the liability, the record. He paused. I'm the man who knows the chain was wrong on that morning, he said. You're right that that's a dangerous thing to be. I don't know how to be a different man. I know how to be a better officer, a more careful officer, an officer who documents and escalates and builds the record before he acts. I will do that. I'll do that every time. He looked at Beaumont with the directness he'd had all morning. Not defiance, not supplication, but I will not pretend for you or for this reprimand or for whatever file comes after this one, that the chain was not wrong. It was wrong. And Ibrahim and Nadia are names I know because the chain was wrong, and I was 4 minutes too slow, and I will not put the weight of those 4 minutes on an institutional failure that's too big and too comfortable to feel the weight itself. No one in the room moved. With respect, Yusuf said, and then he was done. I went through my fourth pen during the 15 minutes of post-proceeding legal formalities that followed. I borrowed a fifth from the JAG clerk seated at the end of my row, a young woman named Petty Officer Simmons who had been watching the proceedings with the expression of someone who would be thinking about this for a while. Wild, right? She whispered as she handed me the pen. I didn't have words, so I nodded. She looked back at the front of the room. where Hargreaves was signing something and Beaumont was gathering his materials with the careful, deliberate movements of a man performing normalcy. He just said it, she said, right to their faces, like he'd already calculated the cost and decided it was fine. I think he had, I said. That's, she stopped, looked at her hands. That's either the bravest thing or the most reckless thing I've seen in a courtroom. I keep trying to figure out if there's a difference, I said. She took that with her. I think she's still working on it. I found Marcus Webb in the hallway afterward, standing by the same parking lot window where we'd talked at recess. He had retrieved his pen. He was clicking it open and closed, a habit that I recognized with the specific solidarity of the compulsive, and he was staring at the gray sky with the expression of a man who has just survived something he hadn't entirely understood in the middle of surviving it. "What do you do with this?" he said when I stopped beside him. "Write it," I said. He gestured vaguely toward the courtroom door. "How do you explain to people what just happened in there? That he lost, and I don't even know what it was. He got a reprimand. He's on record as a defiant officer. His promotion is delayed 2 years minimum. By any objective measure of what he came in here, try to preserve, he didn't come in here to preserve anything," I said. Webb looked at me. "He came in here to say it," I said. "To say it in a room full of admirals on the record, where it couldn't be quietly filed away or verbally corrected in a briefing room and then forgotten. He came in here to make it official. 41 people, 61-degree water, 3 denials. The chain was wrong." I paused. "He put that in the record. Whatever they write around it, that's in there now." Webb looked back at the window. "He told me," Webb said slowly, "the night before the proceedings. We were going over the mitigation strategy for the 4th time, and he just closed the folder. And he said, 'Marcus, I need you to understand that I'm not trying to win this. I'm trying to make sure that 20 years from now, when someone is standing on a deck somewhere and they receive a denial that they know is wrong, there's a record that says someone stood up in a room and called it wrong, even if it cost him.' I wrote that down. I wrote it in the margins of my notebook in letters large enough to see without glasses, because I knew I would want to find it again." "Did you try to talk him out of it?" I asked. "For about 40 minutes, Webb said. Then I realized that talking him out of it was the thing that would actually be a waste of both our time." He paused. He'd already decided. He'd decided before he walked into the building. Probably before he filed the initial report 8 months ago. Probably before the 3rd denial. Maybe the 2nd. The parking lot was filling up with people filtering out of the complex. "How do you write about someone like that?" Webb asked. "Badly," I said. "You write about them badly the first time. Then you try again." I tried to speak with Admiral Hargreaves as he exited through the side corridor. His aide intercepted me with the practiced smoothness of a man whose job is to smoothly intercept things. I managed one question, called across the hallway before the door closed. "Admiral, do you believe the chain was wrong that morning?" Hargreaves stopped. He didn't turn around. I couldn't see his face. For 4 seconds, he stood with his hand on the door. Then he went through it. I don't know what to do with those 4 seconds. I've been turning them over for weeks. A man who didn't hesitate at all would have kept walking. A man who hesitated because he needed to decide what to say would have taken longer. 4 seconds is the duration of a man who knows exactly what he thinks and is deciding whether thinking it out loud is the thing he's willing to carry. He chose not to carry it. I understand that choice. I understand it the way Yusuf understands Beaumont's men, from a distance with a kind of recognition that doesn't require agreement. Yusuf Adebayo walked out of the Naval Administrative Complex at 15:19 that afternoon into a November that had gotten colder while we were all indoors being permanent record of each other. He had his cover under his arm. His uniform was exactly as it had been at 0830. He walked down the front steps at the same pace he'd walked in. I was standing to the side. I had my notebook and my borrowed pen and nothing prepared to say. He saw me. He paused. I think he recognized me from the gallery. People usually do, if they're paying the kind of attention he was paying. "You're the one who was writing everything down?" he said. "Yes," I said. He looked at my notebook. "Did you get it?" he said. "I thought about Petty Officer Simmons and Wild, right?" I thought about Webb and his blank legal pad, and he just decided not to. I thought about Hargreaves, and for seconds at a door. I got some of it, I said. I'm going to try to get the rest. He nodded, not satisfied exactly, just accepting of the limitation. Can I ask you one thing? I said. You can ask, he said. Beaumont's argument, I said, about defiance looking righteous when it's capable, about the danger of that. Did he get to you? Yusuf looked at the parking lot, at the gray November sky that was doing nothing helpful with the light. He wasn't wrong, Yusuf said. I waited. I've thought about that, he said. The officer who knows when the chain is wrong is dangerous. That's a true thing. The officer who trusts himself too much, who starts to see every disagreement with the chain as the chain being wrong, that officer gets people killed. I know that. He put his cover on. I think about it every time I read Ibrahim and Nadia, he said. I think, is this the thing that balances the account, or is this the thing that starts to tip it? And I don't always know. I know that I was right that morning. I don't know that I'll be right every time. Does that scare you? I said. Yes, he said. Not of course. Not it keeps me up at night. Just yes. The way a man says yes to something that has been true for a long time and no longer surprises him. He walked to his car. I stood there with my borrowed pen and my full notebook and a cold that was getting into my collar, and I watched him go, and I thought about two names written in a margin. About 41 people who would not know, today or possibly ever, that there had been a debate about whether to come for them. About a courtroom where a man had looked 4 admirals in the face and declined to be diminished by a decision that was right, and had taken the reprimand for the refusal and had walked out of the building at the same pace he'd walked in. And I thought about Hargreaves's 4 seconds at the door. I still think about them. I have written this account 4 times now. Each time I've tried to be more precise. Each time I have ended up at the same place. The edges of it are too large for my notebook. I am a recording device in a blazer, and what I recorded was something that sits outside the frame I was built to hold. What I know is this: 41 people are alive. 2 names are written in a margin, and somewhere in a permanent record, in a file that 20 officers will read before they each stand on their own decks and receive their own denials, there's a sentence that says, the chain was wrong. Yusuf Adebayo put it there. Whether that changes anything, whether the next officer reads that record and stands up, or reads it and learns how much standing up costs, or reads it and decides the cost is not theirs to pay, I don't know. I don't think Yusuf knows either. I think he put the sentence in the record anyway.